Welcome to CJ360, Fraud Investigation and White Collar Crime. Today we're going to be going through Chapter 1 of the information, and it's going to start with the history of financial crime. So financial crimes date back as far as we can possibly see, back to the time of about 3,000 years BC. There was a code called the Code of Ernamu. And the Code of Ernamu actually mentioned fraud a bunch of times, where the cattle herders would be defrauding one another of their livestock. So we can date way back there. In 1473, the Carriers case was the first case that we have recorded of an actual case going to trial. And this was where a wool carrier took some of the wool that was actually owned by the sheep herder and took it as his own. So they date way back. Some of the modern financial crimes date back to the 1840s in the Victorian Society in England, and so that's where we will pick up. So the period from 1840 to 1880s are called the modern financial crimes. That era of financial crimes were called business laws. And society really didn't see those as a big deal. And so you start to see from that time forward, white collar crime was never really seen as a equatable to something such as a street crime, what we call street crime today. So something like a murder or a theft or robbery, any of those types of crimes. White collar crime was never seen in that same light. In 1863, the False Claims Act came about. Both sides of the Civil War, both the North and the South, were sold sick horses, defective weapons, and rotten food, and that became known as the False Claim Act. In other words, what they were sold was defective. And then in 1890, the Sherman Act came about, and it came about to attempt to outlaw monopolies in the United States. We still see this today in the United States, and what we've seen is that many other countries have followed the United States lead in this. During the 1890s and the early 1900s, the muckrakers became known, and that was where journalists who were attempting to expose corruption, they were known as muckrakers. They were trying to expose corruption in both the public and private sectors, and their work continued in through the early 1990s up into the 1920s, when the boom really hit. And then in 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act took effect. The U.S. Congress strengthened the Sherman Act against monopolies. Again, something that we still see increasing in scope today. And although the legislature was attempting to take control of white-collar crime, the judicial branch of government was not sentencing offenders commensurate with their crimes. And again, this took place for most of the 20th century. We really didn't start to see those white-collar crimes enhance in penalties until venture to say the early 1990s, early to mid 1990s. Now, someone you've probably heard of, but never really knew it was a person. Charles Ponzi is known for the Ponzi scheme, and his reign only lasted a few years, from 1918 to 1920. What Charles Ponzi did is he devised a plan to purchase. They were called international relay coupons, and what he would do is he would exchange those for expensive stamps in another country, and this endeavor, it made him about $250,000 a day. And think about that. In 1918 to 1920, making $250,000 a day. I can't imagine making $250,000 a day in today's dollars. Imagine how he was living after making that amount of money in the late 19 teens. He basically got a large number of investors to invest in this scheme with him. And what he would do is he would take the money from the people who were just putting into the fund, and then he would pay out those that had been in longer. In 1920, the whole thing collapsed, and generally the way a Ponzi scheme collapses is you don't have as many people putting money into the scheme, and therefore you don't have the money to give back out to those early investors. In 1920, he was charged with 86 counts of mail fraud, and he pled guilty to that. Now, keep in mind, this was mail fraud. This isn't any type of white-collar crime. Back in the 1920s, you're looking at everything was done through the mail. And so the only thing they could get him, charge him with, was mail fraud. So now we'll fast forward from 1920 through the economic depression of the late 1920s, early 1930s, up through the mid 1930s. In 1939, Edwin Sutherland was actually the first person to use the term white-collar crime, and he coined that in the presidential address to the American Sociological Society. What he said was, white-collar crime may be defined approximately as a crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status in the course of his occupation. And that's what white-collar crime was originally designed. That's what he originally coined it as. And so that was the first time white-collar crime was ever used as a term. So one of the issues that Sutherland, the position that he took, was that the executive branch of government was not interested in enforcing white-collar crime. Again, you're looking at the late 1930s, right after the Great Depression. And so there was not a whole lot of appetite for punishing people for making money. And so white-collar crime was not really enforced a whole lot. He also argued that that was the reason that police and the judiciary weren't interested in white-collar crime, was just because of the socioeconomic status of the offenders. However, there were many of other criminologists at the time that were arguing that these crimes were committed throughout the financial chain by all levels of socioeconomic status. So I think we're looking at a time when, right after the Great Depression, there just wasn't an appetite for it. I'll add another thing in. I don't think a whole lot of police enforcing the laws. I don't think there are a whole lot of police that understand white-collar crime completely and would even know how to investigate it. And that's one of the things that we're going to go through in this class, is how to investigate white-collar crime, how to investigate when someone actually commits could be a misappropriation of funds, could be anything like that. And we're going to go through those and see how we would actually investigate those types of crime. Continuing on through the 1940s through the 1960s, again, very little attention was paid to white-collar crime. the white collar crime at that time they were called occupational crimes. Fast forward to the 1970s, society began to pay attention to white collar crime a little bit, and basically the macroeconomic conditions of the time had begun to deteriorate in the 1970s, and it was not unlike that of the 1930s, but to nowhere near to the degree of the Great Depression. And so the attention of the world started to focus on white collar crime. And again, this is in the late 1970s. The 1970s is when we started to see society start to pay attention to white collar crime. We started to focus on individual businessmen who were committing crime. We started to look at politicians that may have some corruption issues, and some corporations that may have some business practices that were not necessarily ethical. We started to see that in the 1970s. The other thing we started to do is we started on the legislative side to enact laws for different types of crime, creating typologies of white collar crime, such as embezzlement, fraud, and environmental crimes. These types of crimes still are on the books today and have been redefined over the last 50 years, but have continued to be designated as crimes. So the 1980s to the early 2000s, this is when we started to see a lot of advances in technology. Computer systems started to get smaller and smaller, and the public release of the internet came about. So as we started to see this technology increase, the prosecutions for high-profile financial crimes started to increase as well. The first big one was Ivan Boesky in 1986, an investment banker convicted of insider trading. And the second one was Michael Milken. He was a financier that was pled guilty to 6 counts of securities fraud through his company Drexel Burnham Lambert, and that went out of business. And so the Boesky and Michael Milken thing were interrelated, and Michael Milken was the last to fall in that scenario. Then we move on to Charles Keating. Charles Keating was an interesting one. His case was 1992, 1993. He was a banker in the savings and loan industry, and his series of crimes with junk bonds led to a complete restructuring of the savings and loan industry in the United States, and it led to over half of the S&L's savings and loan institutions filing for bankruptcy at the same time. That case drew major attention in the early 1990s, and he was convicted on both state and federal fraud and racketeering charges, but those convictions were overturned in 1996, and he pled guilty to wire and bankruptcy fraud, where he served no time. And the interesting thing about this was it gained a lot of attention because there was a group of senators called the Keating Five who intervened on Keating's behalf. So Alan Cranston, Dennis Kucinich, John Glenn, John McCain, and Don Regal, all senators at the time, went to bat for Keating and got the original convictions overturned and got him to plead guilty to wire and bankruptcy fraud, much less charges, and so that he didn't have to go to jail. So these next two cases are from your early days, and the first one was Enron, a 2004 collapse where Enron was manipulating their off-balance sheet transactions. They were transferring company debt to offshore partnerships so that the company would look better on the balance sheet. Out of that, Andrew Fastow, the CFO of Enron, pleaded guilty, and that became a big case because, well, not only because Enron was a huge company, but it toppled one of the largest public accounting firms in the world, Arthur Andersen. The second case here is kind of personal to me because my wife actually worked for Tyco during this time. Dennis Kozlowski and Mark Schwartz were the CEO and CFO of Tyco, and they were convicted of tax evasion and abuse of funds of a publicly traded company. And that whole deal was what allowed my wife and I to move to Florida back in 1998 because she worked for Tyco and got moved down to Florida as part of their relocation, which was all part of the abuse of funds that Kozlowski and Schwartz were convicted of. So that's it for the history of financial crime. We covered 4,500 years-ish in the last 18 minutes, and just wanted to get this out there. The history of financial crimes will be the first chapter in my book, and so you've seen the PowerPoint for that book first.